let's talk about this unfolding scandal in Florida. A couple days in now, a lot of back and forth over this new African-American history curriculum put up, I think, C1 here in Florida. That the debate has really centered on one kind of clarification that is included in this new curriculum, which where they say that some slaves developed skills that they could use later for their, quote, personal benefit. That has ricocheted around kind of both Democratic and Republican politics. There's actually a lot more to the curriculum that we're going to get into soon. But if you could put up C2, I think you've got Chris Christie jumping in on this because Ron DeSantis' response to this was, the quote was really bad. What was it? I didn't do it, and I'm not involved in it. Okay. And the buck stops with some other person. And so Chris Christie, of course, is going to, eat him up for that. Like, look, own it.
Chris Christie's going to eat him up.
We got Puddin' Fingers on the one hand, and then we got Chris Christie eating up on the other hand. Yes, Christie is, loves to say he's the guy who's gonna, the buck's gonna stop with him. He's a leader. He's gonna stand up.
Yeah. If people close down a bridge on his watch, he's gonna take responsibility.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. And it also is an easy hit because then he's not debating the merits of the curriculum.
Yeah.
He's allowed, like DeSantis doesn't force people to debate him on it. Instead, they can say, you ran your whole thing on what's wrong with Florida public schools and wokeism and how they're teaching about race, and then something comes out that's unpopular, and you're like, I don't know, maybe we'll find the guy and fire him, like they fired the staffer who tweeted the
weird meme
Nazi symbol thing. So yeah, maybe he'll hunt down and cancel whatever administrator did this, but. Then we have the thing that really set it off was Kamala Harris's response, right? Yeah. So let's play Vice President Harris.
They decided middle school students will be taught that enslaved people benefited from slavery. They insult us in an attempt to gaslight us, and we will not stand for it.
Joining us now, the host of MSNBC's Politics Nation, president of the National Action Network, Reverend Al Sharpton. Rev, good morning. I had to dig in and read this because the headline I thought couldn't be true, but here it is, a 216-page document from the Florida State Board of Education. One section that reads, slaves developed skills which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefits. I never thought I'd see both sidesism of slavery taught in public schools.
Well, it is not only insulting, it is humiliating. And it really is dangerous because it will instruct young people, if it is allowed to go forward, not only a distorted version of American history, but it robs us from seeing where we are.
Well, I have good news for Willie Geist. I don't think the headline is quite perfect on that, but I do want to play. In fact, actually, this is our next thought. This is a clip from one of the men who drafted the curriculum, who says the controversy has taken what he wrote on this line. This is a 216-page curriculum. He says that it has been taken out of context. He's a black man who was involved in the drafting of the curriculum that was created post Stop Woke. That's the name of the legislation. It's like all caps. There's some acronym in there. But let's take a listen to what he has to say.
There's been a little bit of backlash to these standards that were put out, and like you said, that these were done in open sessions so the public could listen or watch along. What would you say to critics who say these standards have set education back?
Well, I can't answer critics whom I haven't seen or heard. The only criticism I've encountered so far is a single one that was articulated by the vice president, and which was an error. As I stated in my response to the vice president, it was categorically false. It was never said that slavery was beneficial to Africans. What was said, and anyone who reads this will see this with clarity, it is the case that Africans proved resourceful, resilient, and adaptive, and were able to develop skills and aptitudes which served to their benefit, both while enslaved and after enslavement.
Ryan, what do you make of all that?
Right, you can't judge it based on just one little kind of snippet taken out of context. But there is some other disturbing stuff in the curriculum that suggests the direction that it was trying to go. And it reminded me of being in a dorm room in college and arguing with people about slavery, and you saw a lot of those same arguments that you'd hear then kind of gussied up into kind of curriculum language in here. One of them being that, well, serfs and slaves are kind of really similar. So it's actually, you can't blame the U.S. because like there's always been there were serfs before we had capitalism, we had feudalism. Then you'd also hear often, well, actually, a lot of the slave traders were Africans, and Africans have had elements of slavery through war fighting culture for hundreds of years. So actually, you can't blame the United States for that because it's an African thing. And then you'd hear, well, it was a lot worse in the Caribbean. The Caribbean slavery, boy, let me tell you about how bad that was. And then you would hear that, right, some people gain skills, and so it all kind of flows into this idea that yes, slavery was an abomination. However, relatively, it's not as bad as you might think because it's actually they're doing it for thousands of years. It happened in Africa. It was worse in the Caribbean. And then the question you have to ask is, okay, let's stipulate that all of those things are true. They mention that the word slave comes from Slav, so the Slavs were enslaved in like the 9th century. It's like, okay, let's say that's true. What's the point of telling people that? Like, what are you trying to get people to take from that? That why make an argument that slavery was relatively better than you might have thought it was? Like I think it's to get you to a place that says that doesn't undermine the kind of American exceptionalism that we're trying to kind of push through a purely patriotic education. And I think that very quickly then becomes false in a sense that even if it's true on all of the various points, it becomes false overall, and it doesn't really serve the students. And there is also, to its credit, the curriculum talks about slave resistance and slave rebellions, and talks about the slaves who escaped Underground Railroad and then served in the Union Army, fighting, for not just their own freedom, but for the emancipation of the 4 million slaves throughout the South, which has to be understood. We're talking 4 million enslaved people. Puts it in a category that just is substantially removed from these other things that they try to say, well, it's not as bad as it was over here.
Right.
And so that's where I come down on this. That it's just it is clearly trying to move in a direction that is unnecessary. Now, Harris seems to have just gone off that one little clip, and it's interesting that we were able to find the place where she's able to make a direct, firm, and passionate case. Yes. And it's against slavery. Right. So we found the line.
That was like animated Kamala Harris that everyone thought was going to do so well in 2020. And you see that so rarely now. I had the same reaction to that clip. What you just made is a really interesting substantive critique. I have seen so little of that. What I have seen is this despicable smear by Kamala Harris, elevated by the corporate press, saying one black voice is more important than other black voices, or one black voice is more inherently legitimate than the black voices defending the curriculum that they drafted, actual academics. And that would be a much more interesting conversation about why are you trying to sort of put slavery, American slavery, in this historical perspective to the point where it seems as though you're trying to absolve. I haven't read the full curriculum. I think that's an interesting critique. From what I've heard of the curriculum, it's pretty balanced to the point you made about even including rebellions in it. I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with the 2 sentences that were taken dramatically out of context, and we're saying actually that people who found themselves in these incredibly trying circumstances of their own agency made the best of it in ways that speak to remarkable resilience. And I don't think there's one factual problem with that claim. I think your point is interesting. Why is this being, is this being tied into a problematic narrative? That's always a worthwhile question. But this has been such a useless conversation because there's just been a debate against the straw man. Yeah. The straw man of Ron DeSantis. It's basically the "don't say gay" controversy. Again, were there substantive problems in that bill? I actually think there were. Are they what anybody is saying they are? No. And it created a completely false caricature of Ron DeSantis, of Florida Republicans in the press that is still indelible in the public's imagination today. And that's not helpful to fighting what could be very real problems in the curriculum, to correcting what could be very real problems in the curriculum, when you have the vice president taking this highly publicized trip to Florida to push back on an abject smear. It's not just that she's disagreeing with the substance of the curriculum, it's that she's actually accusing people of despicable racism. And I think that's despicable in and of itself. It's not like we're disagreeing over marginal tax rates. She's accusing Black academics and Ron DeSantis of facilitating white supremacy, essentially, and on what I think is a lie. And I find that completely despicable. I think Chris Christie has an interesting point in his response. I think Ron DeSantis, his response was weird. I didn't do it, and I wasn't involved in it. For Ron DeSantis, you would think he would be leaning into it and saying it's a media lie. This is your whole
thing, man.
The guy's, he's clearly lost his mojo, I think, a little bit, and this gets to C6. We can put that up on the screen. Losing a third of his campaign staff. He's sending out talking points to his key supporters.
C6B.
Yeah, and we have you can go to the next element here, talking points being sent around, where Ryan mentions they actually spelled brake wrong.
Yeah, they're going to tap the brakes. They're going to press the brakes.
Oh yeah, you can see that in the first bullet point of the second section.
They spelled it brake.
And then we can go to our last.
They laid off the copy editor.
Yeah, they actually very well may have. But you can see in the next one the point about layoffs. About a third of his staff in the next element, if we go to that, just announced another round of layoffs last night. So more than a third of his 2024 campaign staff. Now, Ryan, another thing I think is interesting that Chris Christie says is he goes on to say, we're arguing about these issues, these smaller issues, when we've got big issues in our country like runaway inflation that continues to hurt families, like an education system, blah, blah, blah. And he's making a point that's half right and half wrong. Half right in that I think DeSantis has overemphasized the culture war in his campaign? Yes. Half wrong in that actually some of these culture war issues, like what kids are being taught in school, does matter to parents. Ask Glenn Youngkin. These are kitchen table issues in the same way that inflation is a kitchen table issue. Parents really care about what they're paying for in public schools and their kids are hearing on a daily basis. You have to talk about it in the right way, though. And the DeSantis meme campaign has not necessarily been the right way.
Right, and DeSantis has pushed his meme campaign way off. If we could go back to, was it C6B here, which is it's the Ben Jacobs tweet of the. Yeah, so if you look right in the middle there, it says the central themes of the Great American Comeback. These are the talking points that the campaign sent out to reporters. Number 1, economy. Number 2, border. Number 3, China. All the way down at number 4, culture. Woke ideology has infiltrated our schools and our military. We need a leader who is unafraid to restore our nation's sanity. He looks a little afraid because it's all the way down at number 4 there.
Yeah.
Like this was kind of number 1 up until he was doing his reset, which I think doesn't bode well for that point. That if you can't even win a Republican primary on this stuff, what good is it?
Yeah, it's not the best. I mean, it would be a really interesting test case if Trump wasn't in the race, because Trump sort of makes it hard to gauge what the other Republicans are trying out. But the economy bullet point has a little culture war in it, which I think is well placed on Ron DeSantis, where he talks about corporate elites, the economy benefiting corporate elites. That's a culture war messaging on the economy that Republicans never used to sort of connect the dots to in the same way that Democrats do. So I think they're trying to do both at the same time, to walk and chew chew gum at the same time. It's not as easy as it looks. And so I mean, that's tough stuff. But this should be Ron DeSantis in his element. Like he shouldn't give Chris Christie an opening to come after him on this. Like this is a gift to him. It's a political gift to him in the same way that Don Lemon saying women are past their prime or Nikki Haley is past her prime was a gift to Nikki Haley. Like Ron DeSantis should just be like rubbing his hands together, like eagerly trying to figure out how to make the most of this instead of that first response was punting. Now his campaign has I think hit the ground running with this since, but that was bizarre to me.
Right. But I think he has a messenger problem and a confidence problem, and his confidence problem is coming from just getting rinsed by Trump in this primary so far, and so I think he's not feeling as confident.
Agree.
And willing to stand on some of this culture war stuff. And the messenger problem is that, all right, is it true that some enslaved people were blacksmiths and were able to use their skills? We've talked about Robert Smalls on this show a bunch before. One of the greatest American heroes ever. He was an enslaved ship pilot in Charleston, South Carolina, who stole his slave ship and delivered it to the Union Army, and then ended up fighting on behalf of the Union Army. Ended up serving in Congress. Worked with Harriet Tubman. He was doing guerrilla stuff back in there. Just absolute incredible hero. Is it true that learning how to pilot the ship as a slave enabled him to steal that ship? Oh yeah, that is true.
Yeah. But
it gets too close to sounding like you're patting the person who taught him how to pilot the ship on the head and congratulating them. Good job. Good for you for teaching these skills.
Yeah.
To Robert Smalls, when it's no, you owned him as property and were utterly exploiting and degrading him and his family, and he then had the resourcefulness enough to escape. So I think it's a messenger problem that DeSantis needed to be more careful about. If you're gonna be making this central to your campaign and saying that the education's too woke, people are going to be looking very closely at what you come up with instead. And so I think somebody ought to have seen that and been yeah, that's not going to come off well, especially when you're doing the whole, Africans did slavery too thing.
It's weird because when I looked at that sentence, I know we have to move on, but when I looked at the context that it was in, I got completely with it. They were saying I thought in the context it was, look at how resilient and look at how look at how
there is a lot of that in there.
Yeah, to me it was all about putting the agency on people who were under incredibly difficult circumstances.
I think the phrase personal benefit
that may be
extremely grating to people. That's a how dare you kind of line whenever you're using personal benefit in relation to anything.
Right.
To do with slavery.
Although I also think the media was disingenuous in acting as though this was something that Ron DeSantis and not black academics had.
Yeah, right. If they cared, they could do an
together.
actual segment on what's in there.
Yeah.
And talk about it the way we did.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.